The Seaborne Spirit, a 440-ton, 10,000-ton cruise ship, sailed from the port of Alexandria, Egypt, to Mombasa, Kenya, early on November 5, 2005. When the ship arrived off the coast of Somalia, it had 115 passengers on board. Two speedboats began to approach, and one of them opened fire on the ship as heavily armed bandits tried to board. This led to a clash between luxury and piracy, a clash of worlds at sea, but the ship's crew was able to stop the pilots from boarding. This incident raises the question of how a cruise ship, which is the epitome of elegance, defends itself against maritime marauders. Being aboard a cruise ship when pirates attack is a recipe for disaster. Surprisingly, passengers have been on board during these incidents, but their safety isn't as compromised as you might think. This is partly because pirates typically target cargo or container ships because their SES is focused on something else entirely, such as money, goods, and valuables. This also explains why these attacks typically take place in particular areas and along well-traveled trade routes where pilots see opportunities for profit. Therefore, even though passengers may find themselves in the middle of these incidents, the pirates are more concerned with pursuing their own goals and obtaining valuables than they are with starting fights with other passengers. This is not to say that passengers are completely safe during pirate attacks. It's a strange fact that being on a ship during a pirate encounter isn't as dangerous as one might imagine. But knowing where these threats occur is essential to understanding the precautions these cruise ships take. Some areas are known to be breeding grounds for these marine bandits. Indonesia is one of the areas most vulnerable to pirate attacks. Southeast Asia is the site of 41% of all pirate assaults worldwide between 1995 and 2013. But one region stands out for its history of unrelenting piracy: Malaysia and Nigeria. In 2022, the most attempted pirate attacks took place off the Straits of Singapore. Somalia and the waters around it, a combination of political unrest, poverty, and lawlessness fueled the Somali piracy story, which started in the early 2000s as a threat to international fishing vessels before quickly spreading to international shipping during the 2006 to 2009 war in Somalia. At its height in 2011, Somali pirates carried out 212 attacks across a vast region that included the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and Somali waters. According to estimates, these acts cost the global economy $18 billion annually. Up to 1,000 nautical miles off the Somali coast, pirates take over ships and hold their crews hostage. According to World Bank estimates, between 2005 and 2012, Somali pirates received over $400 million in ransom payments. However, they have since coordinated. The UN Security Council has adopted a resolution to combat the ongoing threat of piracy off the coast of Somalia. But the threat hasn't entirely disappeared. This raises the important question of why these pirates continue to target ships, risking their lives and the lives of others. Piracy isn't just a daring adventure. It's frequently motivated by economic factors. International efforts, such as naval patrols and increased security measures, have significantly reduced Somali piracy in recent years. At first, pirates mostly targeted cargo ships because of the valuable goods they carried. The idea was to hold the entire ship hostage and demand a percentage of the cargo value as ransom. However, the twist is that luxury cruise ships have turned into an alluring target as well. Have you ever wondered why pirates view these ships as floating treasure tropes that demand millions of dollars in ransom from each passenger? The reasoning is straightforward but brutal. Demand outrageous prices for the safe release of the opulent. Significant effects have resulted from the change in pirate targets, which has changed the dynamics of pirate activity and affected not just their tactics, but also the crucial waterways they use, such as the Suez Canal and other key routes. The fear of pirate attacks has compelled improvements in maritime security, changing international trade routes, and having an effect on the lives of individuals who depend on these crucial waterways for commerce. Anti-climb walls, a clever physical barrier lining the ship's sides, are the first of many defense mechanisms cruise ships have in place to keep intruders at bay. These barriers are made to deter pirates from attempting to climb aboard by having sharp edges or slippery surfaces that make scaling the ship an intimidating task. Using cutting-edge monitoring technologies, surveillance also takes center stage. Together, Sonar radar and cameras can detect approaching pirate vessels from a distance, giving the ship vital time to respond. Safe rooms or citadels, outfitted with communication equipment, serve as fortified havens for the crew during an attack, enabling distress calls and guaranteeing the crew's safety. Have you ever heard of sonic cannons? These devices emit high-pitched, disorienting sounds that discourage pirates from approaching too closely. And who knew that water could be such a potent defense? High-pressed water hoses spraying. The worst part is that jets make the area around the ship slick and chaotic, making it very difficult for pirates to board. Emergence of new technology, such as the P-trap idea, a non-lethal anti-piracy tool called the P-trap, is used to keep pirates off ships. Thin lines that float at water level around the sides of the ship are part of the system. When pirate skiffs or boats encounter these lines, the engine becomes tangled and is essentially disabled. The vessel is among a number of if, and when any of the above described defense techniques are unable to prevent pirates from entering the ship. Most cruise ships have a detailed strategy in place that includes detection, response, no financial compensation, and even legal action. Innovative approaches are being utilized to combat piracy at sea. The initial surveillance systems activate upon detection. Recognize and locate incoming pirate ships once verified. The ship's crew promptly notifies passengers, crew members, and maritime authorities of any emergency. Prompt procedures are accelerated. Safe spaces are guarded by qualified security personnel. Armed security teams are on standby, and personnel are mobilized to potential hotspots if things deteriorate. Their goal is to minimize injury while eliminating the threat to the crew and passenger safety is still of utmost importance. These security officers are typically armed, and coordination with maritime authorities is essential. The ship gives real-time updates and establishes contact locations. The ship works with law enforcement to implement steps for consequences. Police and maritime laws collaborate to make sure that pirates are held accountable for their acts. When pirates are caught in the web of maritime law, they face harsh penalties that are commensurate with the seriousness of their offenses. Pirates are turned over to authorities for prosecution. Piracy in the sea is a long-standing. Nations around the world are taking decisive action to combat the threat. In Singapore, piracy is punishable by life in prison and caning, while in India, piracy is punishable by life in prison or death, particularly if it results in or attempts to cause death. These laws are intended to decrease the frequency of pirate attacks and make the pirates who are arrested sufficiently deterrent to deter others. One notable example of this is the FB Halafong 2 hijacking case, where a federal high court in Nigeria sentenced 10 pirates to 10 years in prison and a hefty fine under the Suppression of Piracy and Other Maritime Offenses Act of 2019. These pirates are among the 27 that have been captured in Nigerian territorial waters, which is evidence of the Nigerian Navy's and the Nigerian police's unwavering efforts. Their beliefs support the international campaign against piracy. Think back to incidents like the Akil Laro hijacking or the decline in Somali piracy. These illustrate how coordinated actions by maritime police and naval task forces led to the capture and prosecution of pirates. But here's the bottom line: despite these incidents, cruise ships remain remarkably safe. The procedures in place have proven effective, ensuring the safety of passengers and crew, even during rare encounters with pirates. So rest assured, even in the unlikely event of such an encounter, the measures employed by these ships stand as a shield against danger, reaffirming that a cruise remains a safe and unforgettable voyage. So in the vast expanse of the seas where pirates may roam, the strength of cruise ship defenses and the firm hand of maritime law ensure that safety prevails, making every voyage an unforgettable and secure adventure. By For Music. Now hello everyone, and welcome back to Terrifying Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I was at the grocery store picking up a few things for dinner. After a long day, the store was quiet with only a handful of people moving through the aisles. It was late, close to 9 o'clock in the evening, and I had deliberately chosen this time because the store was usually less crowded. After gathering my items, I made my way to the checkout counter, tired but glad to be heading home. Soon the cashier, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, gave me a polite nod as he started scanning my groceries. I watched him work, placing my items in bags with an efficiency that came from experience. The beeping of the scanner was the only sound between us, and I barely noticed when he paused for a moment, glancing up at me with an unreadable expression. I assumed he was distracted or perhaps just tired, much like I was. He continued scanning the rest of my items without a word, and I pulled out my wallet ready to pay. It was an ordinary, uneventful transaction until he handed me my receipt. His hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary as he passed a receipt to me, and then he leaned slightly forward. His voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard him clearly. "Be careful," he said, his tone laced with an urgency that sent a chill down my spine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard him correctly. What I asked, my voice coming out more startled than I intended. He didn't respond right away, only meeting my eyes for a brief second before looking away. I glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the interaction, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The store was quiet, and the other cashiers were busy with their own customers. "What do you mean?" I asked again, my voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. He shook his head, slightly avoiding my gaze as he began scanning the next customer's items. As I picked up my bags and headed for the exit, I started to feel uneasy because it seemed like the moment had passed, and he didn't want to go into further detail. His words, "Be careful," kept repeating in my head as I walked briskly to my car, looking over my shoulder several times. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he warning me about something specific? Did he know something I didn't? Or was it just a harmless remark, perhaps even a misunderstanding? As I unlocked my car and locked the doors behind me, I imagined all the possible outcomes. I sat there for a while, tearing the steering wheel and looking at the receipt in my hand. I turned it over half, expecting to see a note or some clue written on it, but it was just a regular receipt with a list of things I had bought and the total at the bottom. The way he stated it and the urgency in his voice made it impossible to ignore the D. The drive home was uneventful, but the feeling of uneasiness lingered. I felt silly for allowing it to worry me so much. When I eventually pulled into my driveway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Home was my safe haven, and I was ready to move on from the strange encounter. Every car that passed me on the road seemed to linger for an excessive amount of time, and every shadow along the sidewalk seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. As I unpacked the bags, I couldn't help but look out the window every few minutes, my mind still buzzing with potential solutions, and I locked the door behind me after carrying my goods inside and making sure all the windows were safe. Deep down, I couldn't get rid of the notion that the cashier's comments meant more, even though I told myself I was overreacting and that they were probably just an odd term. After putting things away, I went about my evening routine as usual, attempting to divert my attention with television and the familiar comforts of home. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether I should go back to the store and ask the cashier what he meant, but the idea felt absurd. What would I say? That his words had unsettled me to the point of obsession. I knew I would sound ridiculous, and there was no guarantee he would even be working that day. Instead, I decided to let it go, convincing myself that it was nothing to worry about. But as the day went on, small things began to unnerve me. I noticed a car parked across the street from my house, one I hadn't seen before. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it didn't seem to belong to any of my neighbors. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was someone visiting or perhaps just a coincidence. But as the hours passed, the car remained, and I started to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on other things, but my attention kept drifting back to the window where the car sat like an ominous presence. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I heard a strange noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on gravel, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I went to the window and peered out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness despite its faint outline and the weak street lights. The automobile was still there. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were full of disturbing images of shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I tried to convince myself that I was just dreaming and that the cashier's words had sowed a seed of paranoia in my mind, but the feeling of unease was too strong to ignore that night. Every groan and creak of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any signs of something out of the ordinary. The cashier's voice repeating those two sentences, along with whispers I couldn't quite make out. As the days passed, the feeling of unease gradually subsided, though it never entirely vanished. I stopped noticing the car parked across the street, and it became easier to ignore the strange noises outside. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a frightening experience. But occasionally I would think back to that moment in the store when the cashier whispered a warning, and I would wonder what he had meant. Was it a random comment, or had he seen something that I hadn't? I may never know, but the memory of his words will always endure. The second story begins on a Tuesday night when I was sitting in my living room, aimlessly scrolling through my phone while the soft hum of the television filled the room. Suddenly, everything went dark. The lights blinked off, the TV shut down, and the faint sound of the TV, my first thought was that the outage might have been caused by a trick breaker or something with the wiring in the house. I grabbed the flashlight light from the drawer next to the couch and headed to the breaker box, but as I was about to flip one of the switches, the power came back on by itself. The buzzing of the refrigerator in the kitchen stopped for a moment, and I was taken aback by the sudden silence. I checked my phone, and its screen was still lit, reassuring me that there wasn't a total blackout in the area. 7 minutes, that was how long the outage had lasted. I shrugged it off, thinking it was an odd but isolated incident. The next night, at almost the exact same time it happened again, I was in the middle of preparing dinner when the kitchen went dark. The sizzle of the pan abruptly stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My hands hovered over the countertop as I waited, unsure if it would come back on its own like the night before. Sure enough, after 7 minutes, the power returned as though nothing had happened this time. I felt a little uneasy 2 nights in a row. It couldn't be a coincidence. By the third night, I was on edge. I kept glancing at the clock as it crept closer to the time the outages had occurred. I had decided to keep track, noting down the exact minute it started and ended when the lights went out again at the same time as the previous nights. My unease deepened. It wasn't just the outage itself. It was the precision of its 7 minutes, no more, no less. I called the power company the next morning to report the issue. The customer service representative sounded genuinely puzzled when I explained the situation. "We don't have any scheduled outages in your area," they said. "It doesn't look like there are any ongoing maintenance activities either. Are you sure it's not an issue with your home's wiring?" I had already considered that possibility, but the pattern of the outages felt too deliberate to be a simple wiring problem. Still, I called an electrician to check everything. They spent hours inspecting the house, testing the circuits, and even replacing a few older components just to be safe. When they were done, they assured me everything was in working order. I felt a small sense of relief, but that relief didn't last. On the 4th night, I was ready. I sat on the couch with a flashlight in hand and my phone set to record the moment the outage began. I wanted proof that this wasn't just my imagination or a minor electrical issue. When the clock hit the usual time, the lights went out again. My phone's recording captured the abrupt darkness, and I sat there counting the seconds. I watched the video multiple times in an attempt to catch something that would explain what was occurring, but all I noticed was the light going out and then back on after 7 minutes. Nothing out of the ordinary other than the timing. The electricity flickered back on exactly like it had every other night. By the 5th night, the outages had begun to wear on me, and even though I had no evidence, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. It was like someone flipping a switch off and on with purpose and accuracy. The power outages were strange enough on their own, but they also made me hyper-aware of every creak and rustle in the house. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows twice, then a third time for good measure. When the lights went out that night, I sat in the darkness, my breathing shallow and my ears straining for any sound out of place. The minutes dragged on, and the silence seemed heavier than before. When the power finally returned, I found myself sweating, my nerves on edge. Nothing else seemed out of order, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. On the 6th night, I stayed outside. I wanted to see if the outage was isolated to my house or if it affected the whole neighborhood. I sat in my car parked across the street, the engine off, and my eyes trained on my house. When the time came, I watched as the windows of my home went dark, but when I glanced at the houses around mine, I noticed their lights remained on. It was only my house. The realization made my stomach turn. That night I hardly slept. I couldn't stop thinking about the deliberate nature of the outages and what they could mean. Was someone targeting me? Was there something wrong with the house that no one could explain? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a bizarre coincidence, but the timing and precision were too exact to ignore. By the 7th night, I was exhausted, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of paranoia. When the lights went out, I sat in the living room with my phone ready to call for assistance if something strange happened. I waited in the dark, my pulse racing, counting the seconds, each one feeling longer than the last, until the 6-minute mark. I heard a faint sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper coming from somewhere in the house. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to hear it again. The sound came once more, this time clearer, a faint creak like footsteps on the floorboards. The power came back on a moment later, flooding the room with light. I shot to my feet, scanning the room for any sign of movement. Everything looked normal, but the sound had been real, I was sure of. And I checked every room, every corner, but found nothing out of place. Yet the sense of being watched was stronger than ever that night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left, unsure of what was going on, or if I would ever find out. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore the feeling that something or someone had been frustrating the outages, and I wasn't willing to wait around to see what would happen next. Story 3. The day had been unremarkable, with the hours blending into one another with little to distinguish them, and it was late in the evening when I finally made the decision to go to bed. I was idly browsing through my phone on the couch, deleting old messages and clearing out storage, when I came across a voice memo that I couldn't recall creating. The app showed the timestamp from earlier that afternoon, when I clearly remembered being at home by myself, working quietly on my laptop. My curiosity was piqued, so I hit play. It began with a brief shuffle of noise, like the sound of fat ABT brushing against the microphone, and then my voice spoke softly, but obviously it is quiet here. The tone was calm, almost detached, and the time felt odd, like it was going by in a loop, and I felt like I was being watched. What I heard sent a chill through my entire body. I hit my paw right away, my heart racing. I couldn't comprehend what I had just heard. It was definitely my voice, but I couldn't recall ever recording such a message. My mind went up to try to figure out if it was a prank or if someone else had somehow gotten hold of my phone and made the recording, shaking off the first wave of panic. I listened to the entire recording this time, with my voice narrating in an unsettling monotone as the message went on. This morning, the home feels different, the air feels heavier, and I thought I heard someone behind me, but when I turned around, the message abruptly terminated in the middle of a sentence. My hand was shaking, so I had to put the phone down for a while to collect my thoughts while I peered at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. I mentally relived the day. I had spent the entire afternoon typing at my desk by myself. The house had been quiet except for the typical hum of the appliances, and there had been no visitors or interruptions. How could I have recorded this without remembering? I looked through the file properties in the hopes of finding some clue. The voice memo was unquestionably there, staring back at me like an intractable puzzle. The recording was actually made earlier that afternoon, when I was absolutely positive I hadn't touched my phone. I checked my call and message history for any indications of unusual activity, but everything appeared normal. The idea that someone had accessed my phone felt both unrealistic and extremely unsettling. My phone had been with me the entire day, and there was no sign of tampering. As I sat on the couch and gazed at the dimly lit screen, I began to feel uneasy. I listened to the words repeatedly in my head, each one feeling more sinister than the last. The part about being watched made me shiver, so I got up and went around the house, making sure that all the windows and doors were locked, just as they had been all day, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had assumed. The house's silence now seemed oppressive, as though it were bearing down on me. I went back to the couch and made the decision to give it a try. I launched the voice memo app, pressed the record button, and spoke into the phone so I could compare my voice to the one in the enigmatic tape. Here I am. I spoke out loud. It was impossible to deny that the voice in the memo was mine, but the words, tone, and overall context felt strange, as if they had been spoken by someone else I didn't know or remember being. I am speaking right now, and this is my voice. When I played it back, the sound was exactly the same as the strange recording. I considered deleting the recording to remove the disturbing reminder of this unexplained incident, but I decided against it because I needed answers, and doing so would mean giving up on trying to figure out what had happened. Instead, I saved the recording to a secure folder on my phone and searched online for anything similar. I entered terms like voice memos showing up on my phone and recordings I didn't make, and the results were a mix of odd paranormal theories and everyday tech issues. According to some, devices may be interfered with by stray radio waves, resulting in odd recordings. None of the explanations offered by others for unexplained events or theories of parallel realms sounded satisfactory or credible enough to account for what I had encountered. The hours passed while I sat there reading forums and articles, but I never found any conclusive answers. Eventually, I became too tired and decided to call it a night. As I got into bed, the uneasiness persisted, so I locked my bedroom door and put my phone on the nightstand, half expecting it to record something enigmatic. My phone was precisely where I had left it when I woke up the following morning. There were no odd notifications or fresh recordings. Nothing unusual happened, and for a brief moment I thought it might have been a dream. However, when I checked the voice memo app, the recording was still there, proving that it was real. In the days that followed, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow at the edge of my vision felt like a sign that something was wrong. I kept checking my phone in the hopes and fears that another odd recording would surface, but it never happened, and the recording remained a mystery. It served as a reminder of something I couldn't quite describe, a rift in the otherwise routine fabric of my existence, and a window into something I would never fully grasp. Story 4. It was a normal work morning, with everything feeling predictable and usual. I arrived at the office, set my bag down, and booted up my computer ready to tackle the tasks ahead. As I settled into my chair, sipping my coffee, a co-worker from the next cubicle leaned over with a grin on their face. That was a good one, they said, their voice filled with amusement. I turned to them puzzled. What do you mean? I asked, genuinely unsure what they were referring to the email. They replied, still chuckling, the prank email you sent last night. It was hilarious. My confusion deepened. I hadn't sent any emails outside of work-related ones, and certainly not anything resembling a prank. My evenings were spent quietly at home, away from the chaos of the office. I did not send any prank email, I said, my voice tinged with concern. They raised an eyebrow. Come on, it had your name on it. You cannot deny it, they said, their tone teasing, but with a hint of disbelief. I shook my head, feeling a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I am serious. I did not send anything like that. My coworker's smile faded slightly as they realized I was not joking. They straightened up and walked back to their desk, muttering something about showing me the email. Later, the rest of the morning passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the mysterious email. I couldn't understand how it could have come from me. My work email was secure. At least I believed it was, and I was careful to log out when I left the office. At lunchtime, a coworker brought their phone back and said, pulling up the email, take a look. I leaned over to read it, and my stomach dropped. It was lighthearted, full of jokes, and included a few playful jabs at the peculiarities of our team. On the surface, it seemed harmless, but seeing my name attached to something I hadn't written made me uneasy. I firmly handed the phone back after saying, I swear I didn't write this. My co-workers looked at me for a moment, their faces changing from amusement to concern. If you didn't, then who did you? Was the question they asked, and I was unable to respond. I excused myself and went back to my desk, determined to find out what had happened. My heart sank when I opened my email account and looked through my sent folder and saw that it was the prank email that had been sent late last night. The timestamp verified that it had been sent long after I had left work and turned off my computer. I checked the email details to see if there was anything odd, and the IP address matched the office network, which is where it had come from. Since no one had access to my computer, and I hadn't left it on overnight, the idea that someone might have secretly used my account made me shudder. The entire situation left me shaken, and for the remainder of the day, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone had purposefully impersonated me using my name and email to send that message. I changed my password right away to make it more secure, and then I reported the incident to our IT department. They promised to look into it and let me know if they found anything suspicious. The email's jokes were harmless enough, but the fact that it had been sent without my knowledge was extremely unsettling. Who would do that? And why? The IT team's investigation over the next few days revealed no evidence of an external hack or unauthorized access. They concluded that the email had been sent from my computer, but I knew that wasn't possible because I wasn't even in the office at the time. The lack of answers only made the situation more confusing. I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty nods at me. Was it a practical joke played by someone in the office who had gotten past my security procedures? Or was it something more sinister? a means of sowing suspicion and doubt among the team? My co-workers seemed to quickly forget about the incident, dismissing it as a harmless joke, but I couldn't help but feel anxious every time I opened my email, wondering if something similar would happen again. I started double-checking everything, including my computer security settings and login credentials, and I even started locking my office drawer just in case. Despite my best efforts to take precautions, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that my privacy had been violated, and in the weeks that followed, nothing similar occurred. Although the prank email was an isolated incident, and the mystery surrounding its transmission has not yet been resolved, the experience made me cautious and served as a warning that things aren't always as safe as they seem, even in familiar and comfortable surroundings. Story 5-5. It was odd and unnerving to find a purposeful path of tiny, dispersed breadcrumbs extending from the pavement to my front door, where someone had left a trail. I hesitated for a second, not sure if I should follow the trail or just sweep it away. The ground was covered in long shadows as the sun started to set, and the scene seemed straight out of a surreal tale. I looked to see if anyone was around, but the street was strangely deserted, with only the faint rustle of leaves and distant birds to be heard. I knelt down to look more closely at the breadcrumbs, trying to piece together the purpose of this strange gesture. The crumbs were fresh, soft, and evenly spaced, as if someone had taken great care in creating the trail. It wasn't the kind of prank kids might play, nor did it appear to be the work of animals. My instincts told me that this was intentional, but I couldn't yet tell. A strange mix of curiosity and fear overcame me, making it hard to know what to do next. For a while, I stood and looked at the trail, wondering if I should follow it or not. My rational side told me to ignore it completely and perhaps call someone to help me understand what was happening, but my need to understand also pushed me to see where it led, even though it was against my better judgment.